there may well be an opportunity for us to have officials address some of the gaps that we perceive to be in the Ocean Protection Plan. However, we remain committed to ensuring that we're protecting our jurisdiction in this regard.
One of the things that we discussed was the fact that the federal government, along with the government of Alberta, has commenced discussions with Kinder Morgan to establish a financial relationship that will eliminate investor risk.
We will ensure that this pipeline gets built in a way that upholds and protects the interests of Canadians. But this pipeline will get built.
Just a few weeks into this spat, and none of the parties have really budged much. That was John Horgan and Rachel Notley this Sunday after a meeting with the Prime Minister, and then the Prime Minister speaking from London today, all three of them sticking to their guns. And the feds may have just added some more ammunition. The CBC's David Cochrane is reporting tonight that sources are telling him the government is looking at other companies to step in if Kinder Morgan pulls out. Here to step in for some analysis at issue, Andrew Coyne is in Toronto. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, and Chris Hall joins us tonight from the floor of the Liberal National Convention in Halifax, where surely this will be discussed in the hallways. Let's start with you, Chantal. What do you make of this idea that there would be other companies who would pick up the pipeline if Kinder Morgan walks away? Is this just public negotiating?
Well, up to a point, there was some public negotiating on the part of Kinder Morgan. I thought earlier this week when the message was that it seemed like an untenable position to try to get the pipeline done as a private company, full sentence, which to me came across as a call for the federal and Alberta governments to pour more money into it. I think if I were the federal government and I'd committed to possibly buying a pipeline to get it done, I would be looking for partners if the current partner is walking away.
When I asked the Prime Minister that question, Andrew, on the weekend, what does it say about the country if to buy a pipeline? He pulled way away because no one wants to get into a conversation about whether this is, in fact, heading towards a nationalization of a pipeline.
Yeah, they've sort of weakened their own bargaining position by announcing so clearly that they were willing to get into it. I think there's a case for it, but the only case I would make for it is compensation for expropriation. That is to say, Kinder Morgan has made significant investments in this. Is at risk not from the vagaries of fate, but from government action. And you can make a case they should be compensated for that. But they do want to give, I guess they're trying to give themselves some bargaining position now by saying there's these other players out there who we could bring in, who may or may not exist. We'll find out. But they're also saying, at least in your report, that there'd be money for them as well. Mm-hmm. And they don't, I think, have the same case that Kinder Morgan might make of having, significant investments being expropriated.
What do you think that tells us, Chris, about the state of these negotiations? If that's, the two things that we've heard this week, Kinder Morgan saying this may not be tenable and the federal government saying we may have other people ready to go.
Well, first of all, I'm not surprised by Kinder Morgan saying that. The negotiations are just starting, and they obviously want to play their hand as hard and as quickly as they can by saying, look, we're looking for certainty. Whether you can reach an agreement with us or with anyone else that provides that kind of financing background, then maybe we can see our way clear. But really, this is more about the political uncertainty that's been created. To offer up money by the federal government or the Alberta government as well, in some unnamed form, in some unnamed fashion, is really, in my view, a bit strange, given that Kinder Morgan is a profitable company, and all they've ever said is they'd like to clear away the political obstacles. And if money can buy that, great. But I haven't seen any signs yet that John Horgan is prepared to weaken because there's now money on the table for Kinder Morgan. Well,
that's a good point, because Chantal, that the summit that happened Sunday, that we talked about last week, happened Sunday. You sort of got the impression that, okay, well, things will just smooth out now, and it's quite the opposite that happened. So I wonder whether that was a success, a failure, or too soon now to determine.
Heard nothing on Sunday that gave me the impression that things would just smooth themselves out. No one seemed to change his or her position. I think the government of British Columbia, and that was clear on Sunday, is going to be asking for advice from its top court on what its place in the scheme of things is. And not only because they're so curious about the answer, but because that is the exit strategy for John Horgan's government, to get an answer from the court. And if the answer is no, then we've done everything that we could in the legal realm, and we're walking away. So no matter what the federal government does, I suspect that at some point some court is going to have if not the decisive say, at least a really important say in whether we walk away from this crisis and move on.
So this has to go to court, Andrew, or there's no political resolution possible for this?
I think it's a combination. Yeah, if you looked at it right now, you'd say we're in court up to our ears. We've got about 7 different court cases or legislation that's coming forward that will be challenged in court from the various players in this. I do think what you started to see emerge is the outlines of a federal strategy that I think makes some sense, which is laying down legislation that, yes, itself could be challenged in court, but that puts some definition to the issues involved, gives some guidance to the courts about where the federal government, it sort of removes some of the ambiguity that BC, if it was a mind to, could kind of get in and try and wiggle around in legally. So I think that's part of the puzzle. I think to buy time and to allow the process to work through, I think a financial backstop for Kinder Morgan also made sense. I think offering something additional to BC in the way of environmental insurance was part of the mix. So whether or not that strategy is going to work is going to depend a lot about what the details of that are, what that legislation looks like, what the backstop looks like, et cetera. But the broad outlines of it, I think, are encouraging.
Last point to you on that, Chris. Do you think that there is more to come then from the federal government on this play to try and convince this to happen?
Well, I think almost certainly. The one thing I don't expect is that the federal government will in any way lend its support to any kind of reference case to allow BC to establish whether it has jurisdiction over the coast to do different types of things or to limit the flow of bitumen through the pipe once it's inside British Columbia. This is, after all, a political problem, as I said, and if politics is the art of compromise, all 3 of these leaders are playing a different game than I've seen. Nobody seems willing to do that, and maybe, as a result, the courts in British Columbia in this case will have to have the final say, because even Andrew Weaver, the Green Party leader in British Columbia, whose support keeps John Horgan in power, has said that if the courts rule against British Columbia and say they don't have the jurisdiction to protect the coastline or to do anything further or to demand anything further from Kinder Morgan and building TransMountain expansion, then he'd be satisfied that. That's the end of it. So in the end, that really is almost, as far as I can tell now, the only way out of it.
Okay, I want to do one go-round on where Chris is. So, Chris, you can start. This is the Liberal Policy Convention. This is presumably where they have to come up with some ideas for the next election. So it starts to beg the question, how far are they in achieving their agenda from the last one? Do they have ideas to put on the table? What would get them reelected? What part of that do you want to tackle, Chris?
Well, first of all, they have a lot of stuff that is not yet completed, from the innovation strategy to some of the other things they're doing around superclusters. Infrastructure spending money hasn't been put out yet. I looked and talked to a lot of people here from all parts of the country who are diehard Liberals, and every one of them is talking about change. We had change in 2015. We have to believe that change continues into the next election campaign in order to convince people that we're deserving of another term. So a lot of the big ideas that people are tossing around here, the idea of a universal drug care plan, pharmacare. They're looking at a pilot project or some kind of study into a guaranteed basic annual income, mental health being added to Medicare and into the Canada Health Act. They're looking for those kinds of ideas to galvanize the progressive vote once again, to make sure that they keep the NDP from keeping or gaining any ground in Liberal areas or to holding on to seats that they already have. All of it designed to try and tell people change isn't done yet. Stick with us for another 4 years. There is more change coming.
Is that what they have to be able to pull out of this, Chantal, this weekend?
I think the delegates will find this a bit less exciting than the previous convention, in the sense that the government in power cannot just wipe off everything that's in progress and say, oh, we're the new guys and here are our bright ideas. I think you're going to hear a lot about pharmacare. And that's clearly what they've been trying to set up as a defining promise. It happens to be one that's central to the NDP. But I don't think this weekend is the test of how they go in the next election, frankly.
Andrew.
I'd be surprised if the election platform they run on even resembles what happens at this convention. That's partly, I mean, that's true of most parties at most times, but that's particularly true because the Liberal Party as such hardly exists anymore. In terms of meaningful distinctions, for example, between members and non-members. To go to this convention, you don't have to be elected, you just show up. To vote for the party leader, you didn't even have to be a party member. It's so centralized now in the office of the leader, more even than most parties, that they will decide ultimately what they want to run on. But the other point, of course, is, you know, every time they unveil a promise in the next election campaign, I suspect what you're going to be hearing back is, you mean just like electoral reform? You mean like balanced budgets? You mean like these other things that you promised last time? I think they're going to have real credibility issues with what they're able to come forward with in this coming campaign.
Well, and that's why, Chris, probably over the weekend you will hear all the things that they have started or finished and need to continue with. That's probably the message out of the weekend.
You bet. In the first speeches that we heard tonight from Mark Garneau and Scott Bryson, both cabinet ministers, we heard about the middle class again. Haven't heard a lot of talk about the middle class of late. We heard about the Canada Child Benefit and what a big difference it made. There is a sense, from what both Chantal and Andrew have said, that they understand that they haven't done all the things on their platform from 2015. By the other side, they realize that it can't rest on their laurels, that people are still looking for that progressive voice. And yes, climate change isn't finished. There are so many different things they can actually look back and say, well, you know, we still have some work to do. So to go back to that main point I was trying to put up for is that change isn't done. There's still more change to do. And if we can add something big to galvanize people's votes around that, or at least their conversation around that, that would be a good thing.
Governing is hard. Okay, thanks everybody, appreciate it. Good news for all of you who love politics as much as we do. At Issue is also a podcast. You get extra content and of course the main panel in podcast form every week. If you want to work out, walk the dog, listen to us. This week's bonus topic, the Ontario provincial election. It's getting ugly already. Our win and Ford, Clinton and Trump 2.0. Look for it on iTunes, any major podcast app, and our website, cbcnews.ca/thenational.